Chapter 4. Extraordinary Time 1. Military inflationary conditions and the agrarian crisis. Takahashi financial policy. Using the aggression in Manchuria, which was undertaken to overcome the economic crisis, Japanese capitalism began to rebuild the economy in a military fashion, resulting in the impression that he had achieved some improvement in his situation. However, this well-being was imaginary, because even at that time there was a process of further exacerbation of contradictions and the deepening crisis. The secondary prohibition of the export of gold, which was the first event of the Inukai cabinet, in which the Minister of Finance was financial veteran Takahashi Korkyo, in the field of economics essentially meant a declaration of war on international capital. Firstly, such a policy led to a drop in the yen, which allowed Japanese capitalism to widely apply dumping in foreign markets, and this, of course, led to fierce competition with England and the United States. Secondly, this policy paved the way for inflation, because the government sought to cover military spending in the allocation of emergency financial assistance measures through government loans. All this steadily led to the strengthening of the economic system, which made it possible to wage aggressive wars. First of all, Finance Minister Takahashi refused the so-called 249 carried out by the previous cabinet policies of narrowed finances, that is, policies for refusing loans and raising taxes. The state budget of 1932 compared with the budget of 1931 increased by 500 million yen, and the total amount of state loans in 1932 reached 1 billion yen. Most of these funds were directed directly to military needs. To cover military expenses through such loans, Takahashi began to practice the issue of guarantee bills by the Japanese bank and the open sale of shares. It was assumed that this event, on the one hand, will provide the colossal surplus of capital accumulated in the country's largest banks in connection with the depression in the industry, an object for their beneficial application in the form of state loans, and on the other hand, it will satisfy the requirements of the military circles to increase allocations for military expenses and the demands of financial capital that suffered from the lack of investment. In addition, in this way they intended to avoid inflation. But even this skillful plan, called, according to its author, to kill 3 birds with 1 stone, could not solve the financial difficulties of Japan and stop inflation. Finance Minister Takahashi, under the pretext of saving the village, again introduced emergency allocations to provide state financial assistance. In a situation of sharply aggravated agrarian crisis, further revolutionization of the peasant masses took place. The basis of landowner land tenure was increasingly shaken. This really scared the ruling classes. By all means, it was necessary to save the village, the main supplier of reserves for the faithful army. The emergency appropriations for the provision of state aid were precisely intended for this, and in no case did they pursue the goal of raising the standard of living of the peasantry. But even these so-called emergency appropriations as a result of increased military spending in 1933 and 1934 were significantly reduced, and in 1935 they were completely abolished. 250. Thus, Takahashi's financial policy ensured, as far as possible, the unhindered increase in military spending caused by aggression in Manchuria from 30.8% of all budget spending in 1931 to 45.8% in 1936, and guaranteed profit to bank capital completion of all satisfied the requirements of the death traders, which passed part of the military spending. As for the severity of the consequences of inflation, it was shouldered by the workers, peasants, small and medium-sized industrialists. This was the so-called financial emergency policy of Takahashi. This is its secret. Military production. The swelling of finances, mainly due to an increase in military spending, led to the rapid development of heavy industry, which invested huge capital. As a result, the structure of Japanese capitalism, which mainly owned the textile industry, which supplied its products to foreign markets, completely changed. If we follow the changes that occurred here in terms of the cost of manufactured products, it turns out that in 1931 the cost of production of spinning mills, which occupied a leading place in the textile industry, amounted to 19 billion yen, while the cost of production of the metallurgical and engineering industries, the core of which was the military production, only 9 billion. But already in 1935 it amounted to 34 billion yen in the spinning mill and 33 billion in the metallurgical and machine-building industries. In other words, the volume of production of these industries in value terms has become almost equal. This meant that as a result of the inflation policy, the military industry was significantly developed. Hence the name military inflationary conjuncture. 251. Under the conditions of the military inflationary conjuncture, the Japanese economy was extremely rapidly rebuilt in a military fashion. Its transfer to military rails gave the whole industry a one-sided, military character, as a result of which guns, tanks and other military products were produced on an unprecedented scale, which had nothing to do with meeting the urgent needs of the population. Thus, everything that was withdrawn for the purpose of warfare from common products obtained by the sweat of ordinary people was useless for society. The results of their labor were thrown into the sea. The increase in military production not only did not contribute to an increase in the well-being of the people, but, on the contrary, led to an even greater impoverishment of the working people. Under the conditions of the military inflationary situation, only capitalists engaged in military production fabulously profited. The growth of the military industry was primarily due to the construction of arsenals for the army and navy. Small military enterprises that worked for the army were rebuilt into large arsenals and turned into complex centers of the military industry, linking Yvette steel mills, Tikubu coal mines and strategic raw material areas in mainland China. In addition, military factories were expanding in Osaka, Nagoya, as well as naval arsenals in Yokosuka, Kure and Maizuru. On the basis of these enterprises, further expansion of military production was planned. The main branch of the military production of any country is the metallurgical and, in particular, steel industry. The steel industry in Japan since its inception has developed under the auspices of the state. In January 1934, the Japan Metallurgical Companies Act was passed, according to which the Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Yasuda, and Subuzawa metallurgical companies were merged into one giant trust, Nihon Shiatsetsu Kabushiki Keisa, at the state-owned factories of Yvette. With the formation of this trust, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Yasuda, and Shibuzawa concentrated in their hands more than 252 half the production of pig iron and steel in the country. the shares of these companies began to be quoted significantly higher than their nominal value. That is, as a result of the merger, the Zaibatsu began to receive huge profits, while retaining the right to control the activities of their companies. Iron production in Japan increased from 910,000 tons in 1931 to 2,110,000 in 1935. Steel production over the same period increased from 1,660,000 tons to 3,860,000. Simultaneously with the growth of metal production, the import of ore and scrap metal increased significantly. Japan was forced to import 70% of scrap iron from the United States of America, which at that time was Japan's main opponent in competition in world markets. This was a weak spot in the Japanese steel industry. As for oil, which was important as a strategic raw material, in 1933 the law on the oil industry was passed, by virtue of which all facilities designed to store oil, as well as oil refineries, were placed under state control. With the active assistance of the state, an oil monopoly developed, the basis of which was the Japanese Joint Stock Company for the extraction of oil Nihon Seiki Ukurabushiki Repent. The machine building and chemical industries, which were poorly developed in the past, began to expand rapidly. In mechanical engineering, the production of machine tools, electrical equipment, automobiles and ships was widely developed. In other words, those industries developed, due to which military production increased. Their development took place under the direct control of the army and with the unlimited support of the government. So, the expansion of the Nakajima Aviation Company was carried out at the expense of a loan provided by the Industrial Bank and the amount several times higher than the fixed capital of the company. The rapid development of the chemical industry was carried out mainly under the direct leadership of the army, which could not allow Japan to lag behind in the production of ammunition, 253, and toxic substances. In 1935, the gross output of the Japanese chemical industry more than doubled compared to 1931. Social dumping. A sharp drop in the yen, caused by the resumption of the ban on the export of gold, served as an incentive for the development of exports. Until the end of 1932, the yen continued to fall steadily and in 1933 amounted to only 40% of its former value. As a result, despite the increase in domestic prices, it became possible to sell Japanese goods on world markets at extremely low prices. Thus, while in other countries foreign trade was experiencing difficulties, in Japan at that time there was even a slight revival of it. However, Japanese goods were sold at low prices, because in this case there was an unequal exchange, because the enormous values created by Japanese workers were sold in other countries at bargain prices. The entire loss from such a sale was compensated at the expense of the workers by reducing their wages and extended working hours, as well as by maintaining high monopoly prices within the country. The foreign trade carried out on such a basis was social dumping. If we analyze production costs per unit of production in 1929 to 1931, it turns out that during this time they decreased by 53.5% for silk products, 36.3% for paper yarn, on chemical products by 24.3%. Which was achieved due to the capitalist rationalization of production and the resulting significant reduction in wages and lengthening the working day. As a result, in August 1932, the Japanese textile industry managed to take first place in the world in the export of its products, leaving far behind its old and most powerful competitor, such as England. As noted above, export expansion was made possible by leaving far behind such an old and most powerful competitor as England. As noted above, export expansion was made possible by leaving far behind such an old and most powerful competitor as England. As noted above, export expansion was made possible by 254 social dumping. A major role in this was also played by the deterioration in the economic situation of the colonial peoples caused by the economic crisis. The peoples of the colonial countries began to prefer the bad, but cheap Japanese goods to benign, but expensive English goods. Japanese capitalism sought to expand exports through dumping because it needed funds to acquire the necessary raw materials abroad to support military production. However, exports could not keep up with the growing demand for imported raw materials needed by the military industry. In addition, already in 1934, the depreciation of the yen stopped, and the depreciation of the yen was the basis of trade at dumping prices. In this regard, stagnation in foreign trade began. The latter circumstance has become a serious barrier to the development of the whole industry, which worked for export and flourished through the exploitation of workers. This situation led in 1935 to 1936 to a sharp aggravation of class contradictions between workers and capitalists, and at the same time made it possible for the Zaibatsu, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, old concerns and new concerns. The profits obtained as a result of the development of the military industry due to inflation and some expansion of exports caused by social dumping were exclusively appropriated by the largest Seitsu Mitsui and Mitsubishi. Mitsui concern, which has enriched itself on fraudster buy dollars since 1932 this year, instead of Tokumadan, Ikeda Seiken became the head of the concern, began to expand the scope of application of its capital, and if earlier its capital was invested mainly in trade, banks and light industry, then 255, now they were increasingly sent to military production. So the concern participated in preparations for the war. He owned 7.4% of all investments in the Nihon Seitsu Steel Trust. In addition, he controlled the Nihon Seikosho Company, specializing mainly in fulfilling orders from the Ministry of the Sea. This concern was especially strong in the coal mining industry. Through three companies, Mitsui Kojin, Hokkaido Tanko and Taihei Tanko, he controlled 25% of all coal production in the country, and through the companies Tokyo Shibura Denki, Toyo Senki, Seibu Dokyo, Toyota Juices and others, he was associated with the production of army weapons and the supply of military vessels. The concern also controlled Tokyo Dento and Nihon Ziphon flour mills. In total, Mitsui controlled companies with paid-in capital of more than 1 billion yen. The concern's profits were especially great during the period of the military inflationary conjuncture. So, for example, only one of his companies, Nihon Seikosho, from 1931 to 1936 increased its profits more than doubled. The Mitsubishi concern, like the Mitsui concern, received huge profits during the period of the military inflationary situation. Through Mitsubishi Kogo and two other companies, he controlled 15% of the country's total coal production. Seeking to take a strong position in the military industry, the concern merged the shipbuilding company Mitsubishi's Ozen with the airline Mitsubishi Kokuki. On the basis of these companies, the Mitsubishi Jagajo Company was created. Mitsubishi also controlled many other companies that, by the nature of their products, belonged to related branches of the military industry, such as the Mitsubishi Denshi Power Company, the Nihon Kogaku Kogyo Optical Device Company, the Nihon Denti Battery Company, etc. Mitsubishi Group controlled companies with a paid-in capital of 200 million yen. 256. Jokyogo from 1931 to 1936 increased its profits by at least 2 times. Sumitomo concern invested its capital mainly in companies directly related to military production, and through the mining company Sumitomo Kogo controlled the extraction of coal and copper. He also owned the Sumitomo Kinzoku Light Metals Company, the Sumitomo Denson Electric Company, and the Sumitomo Kokai Engineering Company. Controlling these companies, Sumitomo concentrated in his hands the production of military materials and weapons. In addition, Sumitomo created a new aluminum production company, Sumitomo Arumi, and through it participated in the production of building materials for the aircraft industry, and through Sumitomo Kagaku in the production of explosives. Companies of the concern, such as Sumitomo Kinzoku and others, from 1931 to 1936 increased their profits by almost 4 times. Thus, in all the most important branches of military production in Japan, from the foundations of the military industry, metallurgy and coal mining to enterprises manufacturing military equipment and weapons, Zaibatsu dominated everywhere. In the period preceding the aggression in Manchuria, and in the next 5 years, 1931 to 1936, the profits of Zaibatsu increased 2 to 4 times. Thus, the profits of the monopolists grew during the period of the military inflationary situation, which determined the rapid development of the military industry. We have already said that Zaibatsu made a significant leap in the development of military production. However, it is necessary to pay attention to the fact that under the conditions of the military inflationary situation, other new concerns appeared, which took a strong position in the chemical industry and other branches of military production, where the monopoly power of the old concerns Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo did not spread so widely. As, for example, in the textile and mining industries. New concerns arose 257 as a result of fierce competition between the capitalists. Skillfully using some caution of the old concerns and their fear of risking investment in the new situation, as well as the disagreements that existed between them and the military circles on the methods of waging an aggressive war in China, a new group of large industrialists closely associated with the military strengthened their positions in the country, thus formed Zaibatsu, which are called new concerns. These included Nissan concern Kuhara Fusanosuke and Ayu Kawajisuki. He controlled the Nihon Kogo Mining Company, the Hidari Saisaka Sho Engineering Company, the Nissan Jadosiya Automobile Company, and the Nissan Kagaku Chemical Company. Noguchi Juna concern Nisso. It grew on the basis of the Nihon Tissot Hario Nitrogen Fertilizer Company and began to penetrate North Korea since 1926, where they built giant power plants on the Pudonggan and Jangzigun rivers. Subsequently, this concern turned into a powerful chemical industry plant Japan. They are followed by Mari concern arose on the basis of the enterprises of the Showa-Denko Electrochemical Company, Nakano Tomoya Chemical Concern Nihon Soda, and Okawa Masatoshi Machine Building Concern Riken. Thus, the sphere of capital investment for new concerns was mainly the military industry, and the military inflationary situation in the country contributed to their rapid development. However, the new concerns did not have banking capital and were forced to turn to the government, the industrial bank, and old concerns to finance their enterprises. Therefore, when Mitsui and Mitsubishi took a monopoly position in the chemical and other new industries, the activities of new concerns in the metropolis significantly decreased, and some of them had to move the center of entrepreneurship to the colonies. Despite the rapid development in the initial period of its activity and closer ties with military circles, the new concerns are still not 258 could seriously shake the power of the old concerns. Even in building ties with the military, the old concerns, which in this case were likely to work, turned out to be more skilled than their competitors. This does not mean, of course, that the old concerns did not encounter any difficulties on their way. Closely connected with the army, the new concerns skillfully took advantage of the antitrust of the masses, caused by the sharp deterioration in the life of the Japanese people. The old concerns Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo and others were repeatedly attacked by the military and representatives of the right-wing reactionary circles. Buying dollars in the country further fueled these anti-monopoly sentiments, which soon made themselves felt. In February 1932, an attempt was made on Inoue Junosuke, and in March of the same year Dan Takuma was killed. One of the leaders of Mitsubi's concern, Ikeda Seiken, writes in his memoirs, "The discontent of the masses caused by the events in Manchuria and the buying up of dollars, as well as dissatisfaction with the activities of Mitsui Bank and my actions, especially increased in October 1931. On November 2, a group of 20 people led by Akamatsu Katsumaro from the Social Democratic Youth Union entered the building where the bank's office was located and tried to cause unrest. On December 21, several dozen people, members of the Social Democratic Party, broke into Mitsui Hataro Amen and Iwasaki Hisaya, went right in the dirty shoes, and demanded that the profits from buying dollars be used to help starving peasants in the northeast of the country and to provide benefits to millions of unemployed. But these were only external, one might say, harmless forms of manifestation of discontent, to which the Social Democratic Union of Youth or the Social Democrats resorted. We felt a lot more pressure on ourselves from the forces that acted secretly. Not a day has passed that you were not called by phone. 259. A thug. Gangs of some suspicious types wandered around the house. Anonymous letters arrived in an endless stream. This flow continuously increased, especially in September and October, and did not weaken until December. Gradually, he assumed a chronic character. In February 1932, Inoue Junosuke was killed, and in March, Dan Takuma. The situation became more complicated. Finally, it came to the incident of February 26. All this time we lived in continuous fear. 66. In the face of such events, the leaders of the old concerns hastily held a series of events. Major donations were made for community service, the regulations on officials were changed, and therefore family members owners of concerns left into the background. and new people took their place. In addition, part of the closed shares of old concerns went on public sale. This system of events went down in history under the name Zaibatsu course changes. However, this change of course was just a simple disguise in order to avoid a blow, while the main line of monopoly capital aimed at obtaining super profits remained unchanged. Undoubtedly, the change of course of the old concerns was caused by the unusually rapid development of their competitors in the person of new concerns. State monopoly capitalism. In such an environment, state power in the country was used in the interests and at the discretion of large monopolies. As a result, the tendency toward the growth of state monopoly capitalism, which provided maximum profit for Zaibatsu, was growing more and more. The imperial government pursued a policy of controlled economy in order to ensure profit for the Zaibatsu. Laws have been enacted to control major industries, industrial 260 unions, on the establishment of the metallurgical syndicate Nihon Shiatsetsu, on the control of monetary transactions and others. All of them stood guard over the interests of large monopolistic associations. The government reorganized the Japan Bank, made major contributions to the Industrial Bank, created the Nihon Shiatsetsu Metallurgical Trust and the Teiko Kumryo Liquid Fuel Company. Through its activities, the state itself took an active part in creating the basis for the development of the military economy, strengthened the position of monopoly capital and provided it with profits. But the state did not replace the monopolies, it further strengthened them. Thus, the strengthening of the Japanese bank, caused by its reorganization and other measures, saved many Zaibatsu banks from bankruptcy. So, in the situation that developed in the country after the capture of Manchuria, the Japanese economy was transferred to military tracks. By such methods, the state, at the expense of the vital interests of the people, provided profits to the monopolistic capital of Zaibatsu, who, directing government policy in the direction they needed, sought to squeeze as much out of the people as possible for themselves. In this regard, the plight of the working people, and not only Japan itself, has worsened even more. Having invaded Manchuria, the Zaibatsu, acting in close contact with the military, began to force a policy of war in order to cash in at the expense of the people of Manchuria. The life of the workers, despite the comparative revival in industry caused by the military inflationary conjuncture, became increasingly difficult. Indeed, the recovery in industry to some extent reduced the enormous unemployment generated by the crisis, but it could not significantly improve the living conditions of the working class. The number of workers employed in production increased mainly due to the so-called temporary workers. The term temporary 261 workers should not be taken in the literal sense of the word, because in this case we are not talking about workers who are not qualified and are hired temporarily. We are referring to ordinary skilled workers used as temporary workers. This was primarily due to the desire of the capitalists to reduce the wages of workers and to further strengthen their exploitation. The capitalists, using the presence of a huge army of unemployed in the country, tried to evade the implementation of laws on social insurance and get the most cheap labor. There have been cases of lower wages. The wage level in this period, despite a significant increase in prices, decreased, and real wages became lower than at the very height of the crisis. So, from 1931 to 1936 it decreased by almost 15%, the length of the working day increased. This is evidenced by data obtained by the Japanese Bank. According to these data, in Japan's machine tool factories, which were in more favorable conditions at that time in relation to other enterprises, the working day increased from 9:16 in 1931 to 10:06 in 1935. This is an indicator that the development of the military industry was due to the intensification of workers' labor. Aggravation of the agrarian crisis. The prosperity of capitalist enterprises observed at that time was explained not only by increased exploitation of workers. The peasants were subjected to even greater exploitation. It has already been said above that in the midst of a global crisis, the village found itself in extremely distress. The agrarian crisis, despite the revival in the military industry that began after the capture of Manchuria, became even more acute. Having arisen as a result of the discrepancy in prices for agricultural products and industrial goods in particular, due to higher prices for industrial products, the agrarian crisis worsened as industry developed. 262. The crisis of overproduction in 1930, the crop failure of 1931 to 1932, and the unprecedented crop failure of 1934, caused by natural disasters such as floods, droughts and frosts. All this even more ruined the village. Although the prices of agricultural products generally increased due to crop failure, only large landowners made profit of it under the conditions of land ownership. The poorest part of the peasantry, which accounted for about 40% of all peasant households, could not even provide for themselves and was forced to buy rice on the side. Thus, all this put the peasantry in an extremely difficult position. The situation was no better with a good harvest. When rice prices fell and the rural poor found themselves in even worse situations than in lean years. As a result of the crisis, contradictions in the countryside escalated. Due to crop failure, the number of cases of girls selling has sharply increased. Only in 5 prefectures of northeastern Japan, 50,000 girls were sold per year. In one of the villages of Amori Prefecture, the number of diseases among the population increased due to malnutrition. It got to the point that, on average, each patient had 1 or more patients. The famine caused by crop failure also adversely affected the health status of conscripts who were so weak that they were not able to take part in the exercises. Here is how the newspapers of that time wrote about it. Among the soldiers recruits of the 31st Infantry Regiment, drafted from Iwate Prefecture, 21 people turned out to be unsuitable for military service due to health reasons and was released home for 20 days. This number of weak people among recruits was struck by the military. It is believed that crop failure and poor nutrition are the cause. In another newspaper, no less striking facts were cited. 263. Due to the difficult situation in the village, the number of undernourished children is increasing sharply, so the Ministry of Education conducted a thorough check and registration of children in the field. The official report on starving children cites startling figures. According to the ministry, now their number across the country exceeds 200,000. They are all in extremely poor conditions. 67. Such a difficult situation in the village caused an outbreak of rental conflicts in the country. The struggle between small tenants and landowners has intensified extremely, which significantly shook the parasitic system of landlord tenure, the support of the monarchy. All this forced the ruling classes to resort to the guardianship policy of the village, regulating rice prices, organizing the movement for the revival of the village, easing the tax burden of the peasants, streamlining the system of debt repayment, etc. The rice price regulation policy, aimed mainly at maintaining these prices at the same level, was carried out on the basis of the revised Production Law of 1931 Rice and the Rice Control Act, published in 1933. The revival movement was conceived as a movement launched by the peasantry in response to the so-called rationalization of production in the city. The main goal of this movement was to, using the demagogic slogan "Revive the village on our own," impose on the peasants an even lower cost of living and increase the intensification of labor in the village, without resorting to government spending. There is nothing to say about the so-called measures to alleviate the tax burden and streamline debt repayment. 264. All of them were nothing more than a means designed to deceive and weaken the revolutionary movement in the countryside. 2. On the Road to Fascism Council of Five Ministers during the period when Japan conducted the so-called Utada diplomacy on the international scene, which found expression in recognizing the independence of Manchu and withdrawing from the League of Nations, the Saito government, which maintained a compromise policy and maintained contact with the military, sought to stabilize the situation inside the country. But without support in parliament, Saito's cabinet was constantly attacked by the Tsukai party, which had an overwhelming majority of 304 deputies in the lower house. Despite all efforts to counter the opposition's attacks with reference to extraordinary times and calls for unity of the nation, Saito's cabinet could not overcome the differences with political parties. However, due to the circumstances, the Tsukai party also could not decisively oppose the government. At that time, a political current that was forming around the army was already making itself felt in the country, which opposed the revival of party offices. Moreover, the confidence of the people in a government led by a political party was still very weak. In this regard, criticizing the Saito government and seeking his resignation, the leadership of the Tsukai party did not clearly imagine how it would be able to regain power in the event of a government collapse. In this situation, there was a rapprochement between the government and the Tsukai party on the issue of holding a series of political measures aimed at stabilizing the situation inside the country. This became especially noticeable after the political situation in the country was significantly 265 complicated due to the withdrawal of Japan from the League of Nations. But there was disagreement in the Tsukai party on the appropriateness of isolating the government. The Suzuki group insisted on a firm policy, while the followers of Tokonami and Kuhara opposed it with a more moderate policy. In 1934, the Japanese Navy demanded huge additional appropriations, putting the country's finances in a difficult position. A government crisis was brewing. To prevent it, a powerful political force was required. In this situation, government ties with political parties emerged. In late July, Prime Minister Saito, on the pretext of the need to develop a firm policy regarding finance, the education system and other issues, demanded that the leaders of both parties, Tsukai and Mansaito, be included in the cabinet. But Chairman Tsukai Suzuki did not support this idea, and she died in the bud. Saito conferred with the leaders of three parties, Tsukai, Mansaito, and the People's Union, trying to agree on an agreed state policy course. But the program, presented by the Suyukyi Party, was not new. It continued to emphasize the strengthening of state defense in the broad sense and the recognition of the need to increase military spending. While the highest political circles were in a state of confusion and inaction, events took their course. One after another, public trials followed. In connection with the events of May 15, representatives of the Army, Navy and civilian population were brought to justice. These processes caused new unrest in the country. During the trials, the accused sharply attacked political parties and the financial oligarchy, 266, accusing them of ruining the village and bringing it to complete decline. The materials of the processes were widely publicized in the press, and this contributed to the revitalization of the activities of right-wing organizations, which after the events of May 15 began to decline. The trial of the Army officers in September was followed by a trial of fleet officers. However, if in the first process the motives that guided the conspirators and their actions met with approval rather than censure, in the second process, the prosecutor Yamamoto, condemning in principle the participation of the military in politics, demanded the most severe punishment for the accused, up to the death penalty. Young Navy officers responded to this prosecutor's accusation with a protest movement that swept across the country. In the Yokosuka Maritime Club, a League of Naval Officers was created, which included junior and senior fleet officers. The League passed a resolution in which the agreement adopted by the London Conference was declared unfair, and the encroachment of the government on the rights of the fleet commander was condemned. The speech made by Wakatsuki, the chairman of the Minsaito Party in defense of the London Accords, was met with sharp outcry by a group of retired admirals residing in Tokyo. Lieutenant Osada, a special lawyer in the trial of the officers of the fleet, paid a visit to Wakatsuki and demanded an explanation from him about his speech. So in an atmosphere of chauvinistic frenzy and loud cries of an imminent threat of war in 1936, when the agreement on the reduction of naval armaments expired, they began to prepare the ground for strengthening the Navy. The provision on the main naval headquarters was changed. Its official categories were equated with the categories of the General Staff. Its rights were significantly expanded. Then at the next session of Parliament, Minister of the Koizumi demanded a review of the terms of the London Agreement on the relationship of naval forces. Aggression in 267 Manchuria entailed not only an increase in the land army, but inevitably caused an expansion in the scale of naval construction, which immediately negatively affected Japan's relations with the United States of America. The contradictions of imperialism deepened more and more. At the same time, the following events occurred. Uchida resigned in September and Hirota took over as foreign minister. The latter immediately announced the government's intention to develop the most friendly relations with countries such as the United States, the Soviet Union and China. This meant that the foreign policy was changing. Uchida's policy was over. The so-called Hirota peace settlement policy appeared on the scene. Shortly after Hirota took the post of Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of War of Araki submitted a proposal to the cabinet, according to which all political activities in the country should be determined by the government with the participation of military circles. This proposal was essentially directed against the cooperation of the government with political parties and had in mind the development of a political course without the participation of parties in order to subsequently achieve a change in this policy as a whole. In discussing the budget for 1934, Finance Minister Takahashi and his supporters supported Araki's proposal, hoping to use his help to coordinate defense, foreign policy and finance. The Council of Five Ministers, composed of the Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, Minister of Foreign Affairs, as well as the military and naval ministers, held 5 meetings from October 3 to 21. At meetings of the Council of Five Ministers, disagreements emerged between Takahashi and Hirota, who advocated the development of international cooperation and coordination of defense, foreign policy and finance, on the one hand, and Araki and his supporters, who insisted on pursuing a firm foreign policy and on transformations within the country, other. The upper line 268 was won by the Takahashi and Hirota line, as a result of which the following action program was adopted. 1. Promoting the healthy development of Manchukuo, connected by inextricable ties with Japan. 2. Improving the country's defense capability within the limits ensuring its full security, taking into account financial capabilities. 3. Pursuing such a foreign policy course, which would be based on the desire for international cooperation and the development of friendly relations with all countries and especially with neighboring ones China, America and Russia. 4. Updating of all policies in accordance with the international situation and the situation inside the country and the mobilization of the national spirit. At meetings of the Council of Five Ministers, the political course proposed by the Minister of War of Araki was not adopted. This meant strengthening the position of the bureaucracy, but at the same time testified that the military circles got the right to vote in discussing public policy issues. Following the Council of Five Ministers, at the initiative of the military circles, the Council on Domestic Politics was created, whose responsibilities included the development of domestic political problems and, first of all, the solution of such an urgent task as the problem of the village. The council included 8 ministers, including the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of the Interior and the Minister of Agriculture. At meetings of the council, Minister of War Araki insisted on the need for urgent measures to provide state aid to the village, citing the fact that the difficult situation in which it found itself negatively affected the mood of the army, for which the village supplied about 80% of the personnel. Minister of Agriculture Goto proposed a plan of specific measures to alleviate the tax burden of peasants. But 269 adhered to the principle of reviving the village on its own. In December, the Council on Domestic Politics developed a program of measures to resolve the problem of the village. The program consisted of 5 points and accordingly included the following activities: raising the morale of the peasants, organizing cooperation and mutual assistance in the village, reducing taxes on the peasants' yard, controlling the distribution of the most important types of fertilizers, and setting up raw silk production. But since Takahashi made no firm promises to back these up with budgetary allocations, the council's meeting did not actually produce anything. However, in this case, it is noteworthy that the so-called new bureaucracy represented by the Minister of Agriculture of Goto, in solving the village problem, came into contact with representatives of military circles. Usually, fascism during its formation, speaking with anti-capitalist slogans, appeals to the middle strata of the population who are in a difficult position as a result of the crisis, and seeks to turn them into their support. In Japan, such an object of fascisation was mainly the peasantry, who suffered from the agrarian crisis. The efforts of the Minister of War of Araki and the Minister of Agriculture of Goto were precisely aimed at stopping the decline of the landowners and the ruin of small landowners with the help of a certain policy with regard to the village and making them a reliable pillar of fascism in the country. However, at a meeting of the Council on Domestic Politics, these efforts were unsuccessful. The Takahashi line of supporters, designed to revive the village on its own, prevailed. This indicated that monopoly capital, which benefited from a policy of low rice prices and low wages, made it difficult to make concessions to the peasantry. In January 1934, Araki resigned. Hayashi Tetsuyiro took over as Minister of War. It is believed that 270 Araki's resignation as Minister of War was caused by dissatisfaction with his actions on the part of the Council of Five Ministers and the Council on Domestic Politics.